In January 1740, a chest full of letters washed up on the shores of Deal, England. No ship, no survivors, just paper. It was the first sign that something had gone catastrophically wrong in the waters off the Kent coast. Out on the Goodwin Sands, a labyrinth of shifting underwater banks that sailors called the Great Ship Swallower, a vessel had vanished overnight. 237 men gone. The ship was the Rooswijk, a VOC merchant vessel barely 2 years old, on only its second voyage to the East Indies. It carried a fortune in official silver, stamped with the VOC seal, destined for trade in Batavia. But the official cargo was not the whole story, because when archaeologists finally dove on the wreck 264 years later, they found something the VOC never wanted anyone to find. Half the silver on that ship was illegal, and today that wreck still belongs to the Dutch government. Not a museum, not a heritage trust, the government of the Netherlands, legally, in British waters. This is the story of the Rooswijk, a ghost ship, a smuggling empire hidden inside the most powerful company in history, and the treasure that is still, right now, being pulled from the seabed. To understand what was on that ship, you need to understand what the VOC actually was. The VOC, the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, was not simply a trading company. It was a sovereign entity. It had its own army, its own navy, its own courts, its own currency. It could declare war, sign treaties, and execute people. It was, in every meaningful sense, a state that answered to no state. And at the center of its power was silver. Here is the problem the VOC faced. Asia had almost everything Europe wanted: spices, silk, porcelain, tea. But Asia had little interest in European goods in return. The trade was deeply imbalanced. The only currency that worked, the only thing that Asian merchants would reliably accept, was silver, and the VOC needed vast quantities of it. Every ship that left the Dutch coast was loaded with silver. Not to spend, not to save, to buy. The Rooswijk was carrying official VOC silver. Coins minted in Mexico City, marked with an M, legally sanctioned, carefully logged, thousands of them. But silver had a secret. Silver was worth significantly more in the East Indies than in the Netherlands. Because there were no silver mines in Asia, the metal was perpetually scarce, which meant that any man who could smuggle extra silver past VOC inspection and sell it privately in Batavia could make a personal fortune. Every single voyage. And so a shadow economy was born, inside the most powerful corporation on Earth. The crew of the Rooswijk were not unusual men. They were sailors, soldiers, merchants, ordinary people in the employ of an extraordinary machine. But they knew the arithmetic. Silver cheap in Amsterdam. Silver expensive in Batavia. Profit hiding in the gap. The VOC knew smuggling was happening. They explicitly prohibited it. Their regulations on this point were unambiguous. No unauthorized silver, no private trade, no exceptions. And yet, when archaeologists excavated the Rooswijk wreck between 2017 and 2018, they found something remarkable buried in the sediment. Coins, hundreds of them. Not the official Mexican silver. Older coins, ducatons from the Dutch Republic, from the southern Netherlands, suggesting private purchase, private accumulation, private intent. Some had small, deliberate holes punched through them. Think about what that means for a moment. A sailor, the night before departure, carefully threading a needle, sewing coins, one by one, into the lining of his jacket, into the sole of his boot. into the belt around his waist, not just to hide them from VOC inspectors, but to hide them from his fellow sailors, because trust on those ships was not guaranteed. Everyone was running the same scheme. Archaeologists estimate that by 1740, up to half of all the silver being transported on VOC ships was illegal. Half. In the century before the Rooswijk sank, between 20 and 40 million ducatons were smuggled illegally to Asia by VOC personnel. That is not petty theft, that is a parallel economy operating inside an official one for over 100 years, with the implicit knowledge of the company that formally prohibited it. Because here is the twist. The VOC tolerated it. The silver reached the East Indies either way. The trade happened, the company benefited, and the sailors got their cut. It was, in the darkest possible sense, a system. A system that went down with the Rooswijk on January 9th, 1740, sewn into 237 dead men's clothes. The Goodwin Sands, 10 square kilometers of shifting underwater sandbanks sitting in the middle of some of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, just 8 kilometers off the coast of Kent. For centuries, sailors called this stretch of water the Great Ship Swallower. Not metaphorically, the Goodwin Sands move. They rise and fall with the tides, appear and disappear without warning. A ship anchored safely at night could find itself grounded by morning. Thousands of vessels are believed to have sunk here. The exact number is unknown. Many were swallowed so completely that no trace was ever found. The Rooswijk was barely one day out of port. On January 9th, 1740, a winter storm struck. The ship, 135 feet long, 3-masted, loaded to capacity, hit the sands. The hull cracked. The water came in. No survivors. When the weather finally calmed enough to send rescue boats, there was nothing to find. The Goodwin Sands had done what they always do. They moved. The wreck disappeared beneath them and stayed there for 260 years. In the 1990s, a recreational diver named Ken Welling was exploring the Goodwin Sands. He found chests, old wooden chests sitting in the sediment, and inside some of them, silver ingots, stamped with 4 letters, of VOC Amsterdam, Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie. The Rooswijk had resurfaced, but what happened next tells you everything about what the VOC actually was, and why its legacy is still contested today. The Dutch government was contacted, because the wreck legally belonged to them. Not to Ken Welling, not to Britain, whose waters it sat in, not to any museum or heritage organization. When the VOC was dissolved in 1799, the Dutch government absorbed all its assets, its debts, its territories, its property, including its ships, including the ships that were still sitting on the ocean floor. The silver ingots were quietly recovered in 2004 and handed directly to the Dutch government. And then a salvage operation was conducted, one that drew significant international criticism from heritage organizations, who argued that proper archaeological protocols had not been followed. 2 years later, the Rooswijk was designated a protected wreck site under British law. No further salvage permitted, but the Dutch government retained ownership. A 300-year-old corporation, dissolved over 2 centuries ago, still casting its legal shadow on a seabed off the coast of England. By 2016, the Rooswijk had a new problem: erosion. Shipworms, small organisms that bore through waterlogged wood, destroying the structural integrity of wrecks that have survived for centuries. The wreck was placed on Historic England's Heritage at Risk Register. And so, in 2017 and 2018, a joint expedition was launched. The Dutch Cultural Heritage Agency and Historic England, and the two governments who shared custody of this ship, sending archaeological divers down to document, excavate and preserve whatever they could find. What they brought up was astonishing. Over 1,000 artifacts, personal items, combs, buttons, buckles, fragments of the officers' dining room, 50 muskets still in the constable's cabin, a collection of 100 intricately etched saber blades featuring the faces of the sun and the moon, and the coins. 1,846 coins recovered, the official Mexican silver, the smuggled ducatons, and the ones with the small, deliberate holes, the physical evidence of what the crew had been doing in the weeks before they sailed. 2 leg bones were also recovered, the first physical remains of any Rooswijk crew member. Researchers in Amsterdam had identified 19 of the 237 men by name from VOC archive documents, 270 years after they drowned with illegal silver sewn into their clothes. The wreck had become something more than a shipwreck. It was a document, a record of how the most powerful company in history actually worked. Not in the boardroom, but in the hold, in the boot, in the belt. The Rooswijk is still there, 25 meters down, on the Goodwin Sands, still being studied, still being argued over, still legally the property of the Dutch state. And the questions it raises have not ended. Who owns history? The Netherlands says, we do. The VOC's assets pass to us. The wreck is Dutch sovereign property. Britain says it sits in our waters, under our law. We manage the site. The archaeologists say it belongs to no one. It belongs to the record. There is one more thing worth saying. The smuggling operation that the Rooswijk's crew was running, sewing coins into their jackets, hiding silver in their boots, was not unique to them. It was happening on every ship. It had been happening for 100 years. The VOC knew. The VOC looked the other way because the system worked. And this is the pattern you will see again and again in the history of financial empires. The official rules and the actual rules are never the same document. Power does not prohibit the behavior it depends on. It simply pretends to. The same playbook. 300 years later, different clothes. The Rooswijk left the Netherlands on January 8, 1740. It never arrived. 237 men went down with it. Most of their names are still unknown. But what they carried in their pockets, hidden from their employers, hidden from each other, sewn into their very clothes, has outlasted everything. The company that employed them is gone. The empire they were part of is gone. The world they knew is gone. The silver is still being catalogued in a museum in Vlissingen. And the Dutch government still owns the wreck. If you want to understand how power actually works, not the version in the textbooks, but the real version, you do not start with the boardrooms and the treaties. You start with the Goodwin Sands. You start with the coins in a dead man's boot. The here and 17. Next time, we go deeper.